Welcome to Cover to Cover Book Beat. I'm your host, Roger Nichols. Our guest today has written a book that is absolutely essential to understanding the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area, how it came to be, why it came to be, and where it is today. The book is titled A Force for Nature, Nancy Russell's Fight to Save the Columbia Gorge, and the author, Bowen Blair, is uniquely qualified to write it. An East Coast native who has since found his way to the West and earned his undergraduate degree at Yale. He was lured to this coast and obtained a law degree from Lewis and Clark. His passion for conservation led him to be picked as the first executive director of the Friends of the Columbia Gorge. He worked closely with Nancy, both here in the Northwest and in the halls of Congress, where he had a ringside seat at the political maneuvering that resulted in the passage of the National Scenic Area Act. Later, he spent a couple of decades working for the Trust for Public Lands, where one of his achievements was securing 10,000 acres near Hell's Canyon for the Nez Perce Tribe, their first return to Oregon since the War of 1877. He followed that up by forming with current National Parks Director Chuck Sams Indian Country Conservancy, the country's only national nonprofit focused on returning conservation land to tribes. In his spare time, from 2012 to 2020, he was a governor appointee to the Columbia River Gorge Commission, where we recognized his value, and he served as both chair and vice chair. Full disclosure, as Wasco County's representative in the Gorge Commission, I served beside him, and though we sometimes disagree on details, our larger goals are the same, and I'm proud to call him a friend. We're very pleased to welcome Bowen Blair.
Thank you, Roger. Great to be here, and thank you so much for setting this up. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's a lot of fun. I do want to dive into the book itself, obviously, but before that, I want to do a little background on yourself and give listeners a little more information about you. Was there a particular event that stoked your love for nature and determination to protect it, or was it kind of always there in the background?
You know, I was lucky. I grew up in the Midwest and suburbs of Chicago. My grandfather lived on a farm just 20-minute, 15-minute bicycle ride away that was right on Lake Michigan. So as a kid, you know, he wanted independence, and I would take my bike and go up to my grandfather's farm, which was, you know, it was only 200 or 300 acres. But as I say, it's right on Lake Michigan and had incredible wildlife from deer, badgers, Canada geese. It was amazing. And then when I got older, my godfather, who was a close friend of my parents, was a writer, and he lived on a ranch in Wyoming. So he allowed me to come out and spend a summer or two there shooting ground squirrels and doing things that were supposed to help the ranch out. But I think he mostly just gave me a .22 rifle and sent me on my way. And it was idyllic for a kid. So those experiences in Wyoming and on a farm in Illinois, I think really ingrained my love of nature.
Okay. And what as I said, you came west, and I have to remember very fondly a conversation that we had with you and Anton Minthorn and breakfast over in Lapwai, Idaho. We're doing a government-to-government summit with the Nez Perce Tribe, and you talked about how you first saw the gorge. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, I had never heard of the Columbia Gorge, a Midwestern boy educated on the East Coast. So I was interested in environmental law, so I looked at law schools, and Lewis and Clark had the best environmental program along with the University of Vermont in the country. And I wanted to live west of the Rockies. So I decided to go to Lewis and Clark, and I was accepted. So I drove out in 1977, and I thought, you know, Oregon would be a great place to be, loving nature. It's all a rainforest, trees everywhere, you know, 45 inches to 100 inches of rain everywhere. So I crossed the border into Washington State and then in Oregon. And I thought I took a wrong turn. I mean, here, high desert, no trees anywhere, no rainforest. So, you know, then I, of course, later on realized that the Cascades were a real block for weather systems. But I finally made it down to the gorge, figuring I was on the right path. And I had a Chevy Blazer, and everything was packed to the gills. And I had a 100-pound dog. The only place I could have him be comfortable was right over my shoulder in the back seat, but on top of suitcases and everything else. So he had his head on my shoulder and was drooling because it was 90 degrees, which I didn't think Oregon ever got 90 degrees. Again, not realizing there was an eastern part of the state. And then I hit the gorge, and I was just amazed that I had never heard of this place that was so spectacular. So, I'd probably been driving for about 8 or 9 hours that day and was heading into a wind, as you often find in the summer coming out of the west. And I had a canoe on top of the car, and the wind literally blew the canoe and part of my roof rack off the car because I was going 65 miles an hour and the wind was going the opposite direction, 60 miles an hour. So 120 mile an hour pretty much blew the canoe off the car. So I stopped, put it back on. But that was my introduction to the Columbia Gorge.
I remember watching your face light up as you told that story that morning, and I said, "Oh, this guy is a believer, and it's going to be good."
Yeah, it's just amazing the fact that I had never heard of the Columbia Gorge, given it's such a spectacular place visually, but the history, as you of all people know, the history is just incredible in the gorge. Then you layer in recreation and natural advantages and benefits. It's an amazing place.
It is. So when did you first meet Nancy Russell?
It would have been in 1982, and Nancy interviewed me for the position of Friends of the Gorge. And it was one of those awkward interviews. I was in a conference room. An attorney for Friends of the Columbia Gorge had an office in Vancouver. So I went, and I was the only one there being interviewed, and there were at least 14 people doing the interview, which was the Friends' entire board. And but it was Nancy who was asking most of the questions. And so I kind of focused on Nancy. And over the course of an hour and a half interview, I think, developed a good rapport. I ended up being her favorite. I think people on the board, including Nancy, were worried that I was too young. I was in my mid-20s at that point. So when they hired me, they paired me up with a more experienced attorney, a guy called Alan Merson, who was great, who kind of I shadowed for the first few months. And that worked out very well. It was only, some 30 years later when I was researching, going through Nancy's notes and things like that, that I realized I didn't even make initially the top 4 candidates. A few people either dropped out or more accurately, the board decided they weren't the right mix for Friends of the Columbia Gorge. So I pulled in out of, I think, 4th place and was then made the executive director with Alan Merson. So it was a great experience. But to get back to your question, that's when I first met Nancy. But over the course of 25 years, we developed a really close rapport. We saw things the same way. She was, I think, a great person to work with and for. She really believed in making arguments based on fact, getting the details right. She would do everything from helping write reports to giving out nightly presentations of a slideshow that she did about the class of 1916 and how it protected the gorge and things like that. She was just an amazing woman to work with and for.
One of the things that I have to really admire about this is the research that you've done for this. How long did it take you to write this thing? I remember talking to you about it some years ago.
It took 10 years, Roger. It was a long endeavor. And, when I went into it, I knew it was going to take a while because I knew pretty well how I wanted to tell the story. But there were parts of it that were still unknown to me, particularly Nancy growing up, her background. And then I wanted to make sure that I got other people's perspectives too, that it wasn't just mine. And then there was a lot of work on the legislation. It had been a long time since that passed. So it took 10 full years to research and to write. And it was pretty much full time. I was doing other things, but every day for 6 to 8 hours, I'd be researching and eventually writing.
And you came up with some amazing things. I particularly am delighted about your description of her in the Oregonian in 1942, I think, and as a scrap drive. That's a nice little gem to read about.
Well, it's such a wonderful picture of Nancy because she's standing with, I think it's two other young girls. Nancy was 10 at the time, maybe 11, and she towers above them. She's a head above them, and she's looking directly at the camera, which is classic Nancy. You know, it was just face the issue head on. And she's got a wonderful crooked smile on her face. So I really enjoyed that picture. I'm glad you did too.
Yeah. And there's a lot of really interesting things that I learned, and I'm a lifelong resident of the Gorge, and my family's been here for 5 generations, but I wasn't really aware
And you
about.
really appreciate the I was just going to say, and you really appreciate the history and know the history
Yeah.
better than just about anybody. So
Well,
I'm glad I was able to get something you didn't know.
well, and
I'm
what I
sorry I interrupted though.
no problem. I was really surprised to find out about the very early efforts to preserve the gorge back in the early part of the 20th century, which I wasn't unaware of. We never studied or learned that anywhere.
Yeah, and you know what's really, as you of all people know, history has a way of repeating itself.
Yeah.
And the first bill to actually be introduced in Congress to protect the gorge was in 1916 by Senator Chamberlain in Oregon. And it had great support, at least in the Portland metro area. It had support from the Chamber of Commerce and other organizations, but it was opposed by the Forest Service, which didn't want to cede any ground to the National Park Service, and the National Park Service had been established a few months before. Yeah. So, we see these same issues, kind of a Portland protect the gorge dynamic, with the forest being reluctant, which certainly was the case in the 1980s too. And you have natural resource people or industries that were based on extracting the resources, in this case, particularly sheep herders who wanted to graze their sheep on the slopes of Mount Hood. So they opposed it. And so those same sort of dynamics were pretty evident 60 years later. It's just very interesting how that works.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. One of the things that I want to talk a little bit more about Nancy again, things that I learned. I love the fact that I didn't know that her maiden name was Nancy Neighbor, which is totally perfect for her.
It is, yes, Nancy Neighbor. And then she, of course, acquired the name Russell after she married Bruce. Mm-hmm. And she met Bruce because the two families had cabins, really primitive cabins mm-hmm. at Elk Lake in the Cascades.
Yeah. Also, and I'm going to find the quote here because I've got a whole list of things to talk to you about. But when let me start back again. I want to go back to the beginning because the beginning of this book is absolutely poetic. When I first heard that a lawyer was writing a book, I thought, oh, it'll be erudite, but arid. And I found out it was erudite and electrifying instead. So
thank you.
And one of the things I really didn't appreciate John Yeon efforts because you were able to identify the exact moment that this thing started. Tell us about that night because it's fabulous.
Sure. Thank you, Roger. John Yeon was a noted architect. He never got his license, but he was one of the Northwest's best architects, was internationally renowned. And he loved nature. He was on the first Parks Commission in Oregon. He had been fighting for the gorge at that point. To that point, when he met Nancy, it was 1979. But he had been fighting for the gorge for 50 years. And he had been able to get President Roosevelt to agree that electricity sold from Bonneville Dam would be sold at what's called a postage stamp rate. So Cascade Locks would pay as much as Seattle for the electricity. And the danger of what was being proposed at that point was a graduated rate. So that would mean the closer you were to Bonneville Dam, the less you would pay for electricity. The farther away you were, the more you would pay. And there was a lot of support, as you can imagine, even in Portland, for that sort of graduated rate. But John had bought a place in, I want to say it was the 60s, called the Shire across from Multnomah Falls. And John was a purist in every sense of the word. And he really wanted to see the gorge protected, and he really wanted the Oregon coast protected too. And he wouldn't put up with half measures. He had been fighting, as I say, for the gorge for 50 years. And at this point, he was 70 years old, 69 years old, and he was tiring, and he hadn't made any progress. He had fought Governor Atiyeh. He had fought Nanny Warren, who was on the Gorge Commission that was established in the 1950s. His only victory really had been the graduated rate from Bonneville Dam, but he had really elevated the issue. So that was a victory in sorts. So he wanted someone to take over the fight. Again, he was 69 years old. He was tiring. He felt he was a lousy advocate. And in some ways, he wasn't the best advocate because he had a real temper, but he was a purist. So he had heard a slideshow. He had gone to see a slideshow that Nancy Russell had put on originally for the Portland Garden Club. And it was this beautiful slideshow of gorge wildflowers. Your listeners may not know that there are over 1,000 species of wildflowers in the gorge, 16 of which are found nowhere else on Earth. So it's an amazing place. So Nancy was struck by the wildflowers, but Nancy wasn't just emotionally and visually connected to the gorge. She was intellectually connected to it. We talked about the gorge's history, and she really knew its history backwards and forwards. So her slideshow was about these wildflowers, but specifically about wildflowers that were named after original gorge explorers, Clarkia, Lewisia, Natali, named after Lewis and Clark and Nuttall, and others. So she put on the slideshow. It's about 30 minutes long, and it intertwined the history of the gorge with its beauty, particularly its wildflowers. And John Yon went, and he was absolutely smitten. So, being almost 70 years old and a courtly gentleman, he called up Bruce Russell, Nancy's husband, and asked them to dinner at the Shire. And they had heard of John, many and most people had, just because he was a well-known architect. So he was going to pick them up. And the night he was supposed to do it, he canceled that morning. So they thought, well, that's too bad. They set a new time 2 weeks later. And the day before that was going to happen, he canceled again. Finally, the third time, he picked them up. He drove them up the Washington Bank because the I-205 bridge hadn't been built yet. So they took the I-5 bridge, they drove up the Washington Bank to the Shire, which is just across from Multnomah Falls. And John, and if you've ever been to the Shire, it's an amazing place with this broad lawn dipping down to the river. And John built a berm, so it creates an amphitheater around one of the three coves at the Shire. And you're looking directly across from Multnomah Falls. I mean, it's one of the most spectacular views everywhere. So what John was doing was he was courting Nancy. So he called Bruce because that's what you did with men of his generation. You just didn't ask a married woman out to dinner. So he asked the two of them, but it became very clear to Nancy during the course of the dinner. And they had, a takeout dinner served on the 16th century Chinese traveling table that John had collected. And during the course of that dinner, the moon was rising above Multnomah Falls. There was hardly any breeze. The river was lapping at the rocks below their feet. During the course of that dinner, he explained that the gorge was under tremendous threat, that the I-205 bridge, which would be completed in 2 years, would make it easy to commute from downtown Portland to the beautiful high farms 1,000 feet above the Columbia at Mount Pleasant, Mount Zion, and Cape Horn. So if the gorge wasn't going to be protected in the next couple of years, it would be lost. Those lands in Skamania County were all unzoned, and there were several major development proposals underway. So John used that dinner to court Nancy and did it successfully. And Nancy then, over the next year or two, asked John why he had, without any notice, canceled the times before. And he told her, and she knew, that he wanted it to be a perfect night. He wanted to line up all the forces, whether it was the moon over Multnomah Falls or the breeze or the lighting. He didn't want it to be cloudy, so he canceled one of the nights because it was cloudy. And he was setting the stage as a good artist or architect would do. And Nancy was absolutely smitten. So she agreed that she would do whatever she could, but she wasn't sure what her job was. And then later on, when the Park Service came out with its report, just a few months later, Don Clark went to Senator Hatfield and asked Senator Hatfield to support gorge protection. And Hatfield said, essentially, if you build an army that's bi-state, both sides of the Cascades, Democrat and Republican, I will help you lead that army. So Don Clark then sent out to find someone to lead it. And he also had heard of Nancy, and he also went to Nancy. And so that's how it all started.
There's a quote that just fried me when I read it. It said, while she knew the Columbia River Gorge and cared deeply about it, she had never been an activist, nor had she raised money for a cause. And to her knowledge, she never met a politician. Boy, what a 180-degree turn on that one.
It's exactly right. And that's what makes this such a compelling story to me. She had absolutely no experience. And, you know politics, and you know how difficult it can be to navigate those murky waters. And to do it in the face of 70 years of failed efforts to protect the Columbia Gorge, people who had been much better situated than Nancy had tried and failed. It wasn't just the bill in 1916. Every 20 years after, there was an effort to protect the gorge. We talked about the Park Service bill in 1916. In 1930s, John Yon had come up with the idea of an interstate park. That failed. In the 1950s, the gorge commissions were established, one in Oregon, one in Washington. But unlike the gorge commission you serve on, they were advisory only, and they had hardly any money. And then in 1970, John Yon proposed a national recreation area, and that went nowhere. So it always was kind of the same issues. It was Skamania County hostility to federal legislation, Washington state indifference. You had entrenched interests in the timber industry, mining industry, real estate that fought it, and a variety of things like that. But it was, as we were just saying, it was Nancy Russell, the most unlikely person, because she had no background, as you were just saying, in politics, fundraising, organizing, anything. And she was able to get legislation at, I would argue, one of the worst possible times, because you had both state governors against her. You had 5 out of the 6 counties. You had many, if not most, gorge residents. And you had President Reagan, who was moving with the Secretary of Interior in the exact opposite direction, getting rid of parks.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I want to say I was also impressed by the fact that she used what she had. And I don't think I've ever seen a massive movement come out of gardening clubs before.
Yeah, but she did. And it turns out that the garden clubs, the Portland Garden Club and the Garden Club of America, of which it's an affiliate, have a long record of conservation. And again, that's something most people don't know. The Garden Club of America was instrumental in protecting the sequoias and redwoods in California. The Portland Garden Club was instrumental in protecting certain landscapes in Southern Oregon. Both were very involved in legislation for the past 50, 70 years in conservation legislation. So it's not as unusual as it seemed, but Nancy was a Garden Club member, Portland Garden Club member, and she had this group of smart, interested, conservation-minded women who were willing to help her. And the endorsement of the Portland Garden Club and then eventually the Garden Club of America gave Nancy credibility early on when she really needed it, when nobody had heard of Friends of the Columbia Gorge, which she had just formed. Mm-hmm. And so she had these alliances that ended up being critical, and the Garden Club of America and Portland Garden Club were two good examples.
I'm going to skip forward a bit to kind of the end of the legislation story, because you were there inside Congress and provide a fascinating back and forth between the different forces. Can you give us a little bit of some of the flavor of that?
Yeah, I was. It was so much fun for me. You know, again, I was in my 20s and back in DC, and it was kind of a heady time. But the first bill to protect the gorge of the National Scenic Area variety was introduced in, I think, 1982, probably. So it had been before Congress for 4 years. And we had been making progress slowly. But then in 1986, it looks like, we were getting close to making it happen. And it all came down to kind of that summer. And it was an election year. And most environmental legislation passes in election years because the congressmen and senators are trying to get their constituents, to appreciate what they've been doing. And a good way to do it often is through environmental legislation. So in an election year, too, it's a short session. And congressional sessions last 2 years. And if a bill doesn't pass by the end of the session, you have to start from square one during the next session. Mm-hmm. So there was a cadre of very conservative Republicans who were kind of called at that point the Sagebrush Rebellion, or rebels. And they were trying to draw the clock down to have the session come before legislation could pass. And they were focusing their efforts in the House of Representatives because Mark Hatfield was chairman of Appropriations. And he was so powerful that we were pretty confident he could get through the Senate whatever he wanted to get through. So the opposition was mostly in the House. And the Republicans, a small group, were trying to delay things. And the legislation was in two committees, Interior and Agriculture. And it was in several subcommittees. And at the end, we had gone through the field hearings, and we went through in June the hearings in Washington, D.C. So now it was the committees were marking up the bill where they're offering amendments. And usually it's a pretty civil process and a pretty efficient process. But the opponents wanted to delay the bill. So they offered 70 or 80 amendments during each session. They required quorum calls. They required a quorum be available. And typically that's not done. It's a procedural issue. So time was going down and people wanted to get back to run for re-election. And the clock was ticking down and the time essentially ran out. And we didn't get the bill through the Interior Committee or through Agriculture. The only path in the ending days of the session was through the Rules Committee. But the Rules Committee wasn't scheduled to meet during the last week of the legislature or the session. So eventually on midnight before the Rules Committee ended up meeting twice in the last couple of weeks of the session, and only because the session was extended for other reasons. So the session was extended by a week and then 2 weeks. The Rules Committee met, couldn't get it through, so we were told to go home. Congressman Weaver said, "You might as well go home, the bill is dead for this session." So I was actually going out to the airport and was waiting for a cab, and I got a call and they said, "Nope, the Rules Committee has decided to meet one more time at midnight. There is now a day and a half left in the session." The Rules Committee met at midnight, decided to take the bill to the floor the next day, which was the next last day of the session. It took a 4-hour debate on the floor of the House. It passed on a 3-1 margin. Senator Hatfield then took the bill, the next day, the last day of the session, asked the Senate to pass it by unanimous consent, which is a process used for uncontroversial matters. And the Gorge legislation was anything but uncontroversial. But nobody wanted to buck the chairman of appropriations. So the House bill then passed the Senate by unanimous consent. So it never would have happened had the session not been extended a week, then 2 weeks, if Rules Committee had not met finally at midnight. And then, so we were jubilant, of course, but then we had to get it through, we had to get President Reagan's signature. And the president has 30 days to sign a bill or it will die a pocket veto. So 10 days went by, 20 days went by, 25 days. We weren't hearing anything from the administration. President Reagan called Senator Hatfield at home the night before the bill would die of a pocket veto and told him he was going to veto the bill. And Senator Hatfield said, well, President Reagan, it's your decision. You do what you have to do. And then this went back and forth for about 10 minutes. And we know this because Senator Hatfield's wife, Antoinette, was overhearing his part of the conversation. And then Senator Hatfield said, but I'm going to have to do what I have to do. And I know you care about your strategic defense initiative, Star Wars, to its detractors. And I know its budget is coming up before my committee. And I just don't think you ought to waste the paper sending it up here. So with that warning across President Reagan's bow, President Reagan signed the bill the next day, hours before it would have died of a pocket veto. And as Senator Hatfield said, he signed it with his right hand and held his nose with his left.
Beautiful. That's just one of the many, many inside stories that is all through this book, and so much that we appreciate about that. Gosh, you do. You're a great storyteller. I'll have to say. What's one of the things?
They're such great stories that they kind of tell themselves, and that's really why I wanted to write it all down.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you did, because now we have an historical perspective on it. And there were a lot of bits and pieces that in a book this size and of complexity that I bounced around and took notes here and there. One of the things that was a factor, you mentioned the 205 bridge, but there also was a proposed development just a couple of miles west of Beacon Rock there. And what was the name of that development, which was so contradictory to its nature?
There were a bunch of developments on the Washington side. There were 3 major subdivisions in Skamania County. And you might be thinking of Hidden Harbor,
yes,
which was an 83-lot subdivision with a deep water harbor. There were going to be a dozen or so lots built in the floodplain. It was just a massive undertaking. But at least the developer went through the right process. He sought state permission, and he got county permission, and then we appealed it to the state and eventually won. But it was a huge undertaking, and there were 2 other pretty big subdivisions that the Friends and TPL, the Friends had to fight, and TPL acquired. And then right at the entrance to the gorge, where you now have a national wildlife refuge, that was going to be a major, it was zoned for heavy industry, and it was going to be a major industrial area. So, you had those 4 things going on, and that's on the Washington side. On the Oregon side, there were issues too. But, the gorge we know today would be totally different. Instead of entering this National Wildlife Refuge, Steigerwald Lake National Wildlife Refuge, the first of 3 that Nancy helped create. At the very entrance of the gorge, you now see this beautiful floodplain, and then you look above it to Vista House. That would be factories, smokestacks, and parking lots. And then you see pretty much wall-to-wall housing all the way up to Beacon Rock. There was no public land in that stretch of the river. There was no public access to the Columbia River. And really, with the Friends fighting the development, and then crucially, the Trust for Public Land coming in and buying all 3 of those developments, plus the industrial site, it's transformed the landscape. You have now an intact landscape instead of one that was tattered and, had industrial development mixed in with residential development and everything else.
Yeah. Wow. It's such an amazing journey that you've detailed here. And I have to ask you, there were so many proposals. There was a governor's proposal with like 23-member board on it, which I think would have been totally unwieldy. I mean, it's enough to have 13 at the moment, but 23
exactly.
Wacko.
You can't imagine what it would be like. And so that was Governor Atiyeh and Governor Spellman were proposing back in, I think it was 1982. And you're right, it'd be a totally unworkable 23-person commission. You'd never get anything done. And the guidelines and principles that they would be forced to adhere to were completely general. So there was no assurance that you had even the possibility of protecting the area. What we tried to do in the National Scenic Area Act was pay less attention to who was managing the gorge and more attention to how it was managed. So we wanted to make sure that there were very detailed and clear rules about what sort of development could happen. And we figured if that happened, then it didn't matter if it was a commission, the Park Service, or even the governor's 23-person hypothetical commission that managed the gorge.
Okay. We're about to run out of time on my 40 minutes in my Zoom, so I want to thank you, and let's mention some of the places where people can get the book or find out more about you.
Thank you, Roger. I was looking forward to this interview because I usually don't have the luxury of talking with someone who knows the gorge and has spent as much time working on the Gorge Commission and trying to see it protected as I do with you. So thank you. But the book should be able to be purchased everywhere. Supplies are now low. We've almost sold out. I think we probably have sold out the first edition, but they're reprinting books on what they call an auto-fulfillment basis. So you should be able to get the books everywhere. But if you have trouble on Powell's or Amazon, definitely you can get it at Oregon State University Press, which is the publisher. I think Friends of the Columbia Gorge, which bought a lot of books, has some they can sell. The Oregon Historical Society, I think, has some too. So you should be able to get them anywhere. I think you just might have to be a little patient unless you go to one of those three.
And if you want to find more about this handsome gentleman here, there is a website.